Okay, good evening and welcome to the Science Hustings for Scottish Parliament elections 2021. These hustings are organised by the Royal Society of Chemistry, Royal Society of Edinburgh, Royal Society of Biology and the Institute of Physics. My name is Talat Yaqoob and I'll be your chair today. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and I've been asked to chair as part of the Post-COVID-19 Futures Commission at the RSE as well. This is particularly important given the current situation of COVID-19 and pandemic we are in. Science has arguably never been more important, and the trust in science and investment in science has never been more important. So hearing from political parties about what they plan ahead of their pitch as manifestos are released, what they plan for Scotland in terms of science is critical to the future of Scotland. We have 5 candidates here today, represented 5 of the parties. First, we have Richard Lochhead from the SNP, Lorna Slater from the Scottish Green Party, Jamie Halcrow Johnson from Scottish Conservatives, Paul O'Kane from Scottish Labour, and Julia Brown from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Thank you and welcome to you all. Just to explain the format for today, we have had a number of questions that have already been received. And we will also be taking questions live as the panel speaks. So please do use your Q&A function that appears at the bottom of your screen to be able to ask candidates questions. I will say, however, with the caveat that we have until 6:15, so we will try and get through as much as we can. And I apologise in advance if a question you ask cannot be answered, but we will try and get through as much as possible. And in particular, if there's a question that you like, you can click like on it, or you can ask a similar question. And if more people want that question answered, I will try and prioritise asking that question too. I will be a fair chair, so if anybody goes over time, I am not afraid to use the mute function. I have let the panellists already know because we have so much to get through today. Each candidate will get a chance to respond to each question, and I will be rolling who I start with. We will start by giving each candidate a minute to introduce themselves and give their opening pitch. So if I could please start with Richard Lochhead.
Thank you very much. And I'm Richard Lochhead, SNP candidate for Moray and representing my party today. I just want to thank everyone for organising this event to ensure that the role of science is recognised during this election campaign. In my time as the Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, I have been hugely impressed by our country's science and research excellence. And over the past year, as your chair just said, the people of Scotland and the world has witnessed how science has come to the rescue of humankind, once again reminding us that we owe our scientists and our researchers in this country and internationally a huge debt of gratitude. I really want to pay tribute to all our scientists in Scotland and elsewhere for everything they've done to help Scotland and indeed the world get through the pandemic. And it's really important that going forward that the scientific community and science in Scotland is at the heart of the country's economic recovery as well. There's no doubt that COVID's also taken its toll on scientists themselves and scientific work and research in Scotland. And not only that, we've also had that coinciding with Brexit at the same time. So the SNP wants to make sure that science and research recovers from the pandemic and plays a huge role in Scotland's recovery going forward. And also, crucially, it's doing that Scotland ensures that we come across to the rest of Europe and the world as an outward-looking internationalist country open to collaboration, which has been so important to Scotland's scientific success over not just the last few years, but over centuries as well. So Scotland's a nation with a very proud record in science, in discovery, innovation and exploration, and it's really important to make the most of that going forward through the next 5 years of the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you, Richard Lochhead. Can I turn to Lorna Slater from the Scottish Greens? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Lorna Slater, co-leader of the Scottish Green Party. I live in Leith in Edinburgh. I'm an electromechanical engineer and I work for a company that builds tidal turbines. We're currently building the world's largest tidal turbine in Dundee, which will launch next week and be towed up to Orkney to be installed. So it is a busy, busy time on all fronts. I'm also a trustee for the Edinburgh Remakery, which is on Leith Walk, which is part of a vibrant local network of social businesses that we have in Leith. Only the Scottish Greens have the solutions to a fair and green recovery from this pandemic, which leaves no one behind. From fairer income taxes, free bus travel for young people, and a public sector pay rise, we've shown in the last 5 years that green votes make a difference. But our future is at stake. With global science showing we have only 9 years left before the climate breakdown becomes irreversible, the Scottish Greens are the only party contesting this election with the practical solutions to address the climate emergency with the urgency it really requires. Our manifesto will build on the detailed plans of our Scottish Green New Deal to invest in renewable energy, public transport, warm homes, and protecting nature, creating tens of thousands of new well-paid jobs and rebuilding the public sector to address the urgent challenges that face our society.
Thank you, Lorna Slater from the Scottish Greens. Can I now turn to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson from Scottish Conservatives? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Talat, and thank you for the invitation today. I'm a bit of a disappointment to my family because I'm actually a historian who comes from a family of scientists. My great uncle was actually a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and another was a botanist, and I was very proud to be able to talk about their achievements at the Orkney Science Festival a couple of years ago. But I'm also a shadow education and science minister, and I've seen firsthand, as we've all done over the last year or so, the importance of science, of working together collaboratively to come together with solutions to some of the problems that we face, the most noticeably, obviously, around issues like the vaccine. So, we are very much of the appreciation that science will provide a lot of the solutions to the problems of the future through innovation. And I'm from Orkney as well. And so I've seen projects like the Reflex project looking at some of the issues around how we use energy and how we store energy. And those solutions are going to be absolutely vital, because we all probably on this panel will accept that science is going to be a major part of the economic recovery. And so we need to make sure that we do all that we can to nurture it. And that means starting in schools. That means making sure that we provide those subjects that young people can get involved in, and that we have that path to them becoming the scientists, the innovators, the growers of the future. So that's absolutely vital. I'll leave it there, but I'm very much looking forward to today's debate and the questions that are going to be asked.
Thank you very much. And can I now turn to Paul Keane from Scottish Labour Party?
Thank you, Talat, and thank you to everyone who has arranged this evening's hustings, a really important hustings as we come together to consider science in terms of the election campaign, but also in terms of the next 5 years in the Parliament. So my name's Paul Kane. I am the Scottish Labour candidate in Renfrewshire South and also the list candidate in West Scotland. But I also have the great pleasure of being our party's spokesperson for further and higher education and science. Fairly newly minted, given that we have obviously had a new leader in the Scottish Labour Party. So really beginning to move forward with fresh ideas, looking to the COVID pandemic recovery. And I think that's absolutely key, and it's going to be a key thread clearly through this campaign, and I think through our discussion this evening. Science and scientists have really been at the heart of this past year, and whether that be about modelling the progression of the virus, understanding the virus, understanding the important role of testing, or indeed developing the vaccines that are really a huge weapon in our armoury of turning the tide of the pandemic. Science has been at the heart of that. And I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to the science community, to scientists themselves, to researchers, anyone who has worked tirelessly as, let's be honest, a key worker certainly in the context of this past year. So I think for me in Scottish Labour, it's about the recovery. We are really keen to look forward, not to look backward, to look how we can rebuild a fairer and more sustainable country. Science and technology will play a huge role in that, in terms of everything from our jobs recovery to our education recovery. And alongside my spokesperson role, I'm also a local councillor, and I'm the convener of education in my local authority, Renfrewshire. And I have seen the amazing work that can be done when we start early with young people, inspiring them on STEM, investing in STEM, ensuring that they have opportunities from a very early age to look at STEM issues and indeed career progression. So for me, it's about an education recovery, going to play a role in the health recovery and play a part in the jobs recovery. So that's what Scottish Labour will be setting out in our manifesto, which obviously was due to be published yesterday. However, obviously the death of Edinburgh has meant that has to be moved. But certainly I hope tonight we can explore some of the issues we're looking at in terms of recovery.
Thank you, Paul. I now turn to Julia Brown from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you and good evening. My name's Julia Brown. A bit about me. I trained as a scientist and I worked in the pharmaceutical, biotech and medtech industry for about 20 years, looking after clinical and non-clinical programs. I worked for global corporates and small startups. I also co-founded a company in Scotland that expanded into the US. And I'm currently a non-exec with 2 small Scottish research businesses that have plans to grow, and I'm a trustee with charities working with young people at risk of homelessness and refugees. And many fellows may know me from my most recent role at Scottish Enterprise, where I led support for life sciences and high-value manufacturing. So science is my thing. I really love it, and I want more people to love it. So this is the first time I've stood for election, and I'm doing so because I believe it's important that people who have real work experience outside politics step up and contribute to help shape a better environment for our businesses and our communities. So I'm standing for the Liberal Democrats as they're strong supporters of education, collaboration and diversity. We believe that Scotland is the home of science, and we will focus our support for policies that really put the science at the heart of what we do. We're going to invest much more to support more people embrace STEM subjects and careers. And I have a particular interest in 3 things. The first thing is improving communication about science matters and breaking down silos between scientific disciplines and institutions. We've seen during COVID how important this is and where it's fallen down. The second thing is that we want to encourage a responsible innovation approach. We want affordable and accessible innovation that creates genuine positive impact for society and the environment. And finally, we want to tackle biases in research and development and its commercialisation, be that in terms of gender, race or age or any other bias. So those are the things I'm interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panel, and thank you especially for keeping it short and sweet. Hugely appreciated. As an opening question, throughout the pandemic, we've consistently heard the phrase follow the science, and arguably the visibility of the importance of science to our society has rarely been clearer. What role does your party see science having in the COVID recovery? And can you tell us a little bit about how you would build more trust in science in a time of public misinformation? Can I first go to Lorna Slater from the Scottish Greens?
So I don't think it will come as any surprise to anybody that I feel that recovering from the COVID crisis and dealing with the climate crisis are 2 things that go together. And every single party has committed to an investment-led recovery. That means money. That means we've all agreed in order to recover economically from this COVID crisis, we need to invest money. So the question you need to be asking your candidate is, what are they investing in? And I actually think that government's approach to the COVID crisis is actually not a bad allegory for the approach to the climate crisis. We saw where governments were hesitant in their decision-making, where they didn't make bold decisions, where they didn't follow the scientists, where they didn't consult with the right people. Disaster. And we have more than 120,000 deaths in the UK, some of that because of poor decision-making, because of hesitation, because of not wanting to make the hard decision now, which made things worse later. And my concern is that if we approach the climate crisis in the same way, it will lead to devastating results. The time to deal with the climate crisis is right now. And so that investment money, as we come out of COVID, needs to go into things that what I call 3-way wins, that create jobs and boost our economy, that reduce our emissions, and also improve people's quality of life. We know from various surveys that people are interested in having a well-being economy and moving away from the sort of gross domestic product measure of the health of our society. That isn't a particularly good measure of the health of our society. So you'll find in the Scottish Greens manifesto really practical, costed policies based on technologies that already exist, upgrading our railways, upgrading our homes to ensure that everybody in Scotland has a warm home. This not only will create tens of thousands of jobs, it uses technology that we're familiar with and has measurable results, and will have a measurable return on investment, something that we can predict. It will boost our economy and reduce our emissions at the same time. So this, I think, is what you want to look for. I have concerns around some other approaches which either ignore the climate altogether or relegate it to a sort of separate box along the side and aren't willing to take action on it. The targets we've set in the Scottish Government are ambitious, and I think that's good, but I don't think we should be lulled into a false sense of security. What matters is action, and that isn't action toward the end of that target. If we set a target for 2030, that's not action in 2028. That's action this year. To meet those targets, we need to be reducing our emissions by roughly 10% a year. So let's talk about how we're going to do that next year and the year after and the year after.
Thank you, Lorna. And can I go to the same question for Jamie Halcrow Johnson, please?
Thanks very much indeed. I think it's an extremely important question. As I raised in my introduction, I think it's going to be key. Science and innovation is going to be vital as part of our recovery and as we go forward. And then that will be in a variety of different areas as well. It won't just be, there'll be parts of it will be in the health recovery as well, but obviously as Lorna highlighted as well, within the efforts to tackle climate change and to address it. And just from a very brief look, the UK government is committed billions of pounds already to in terms of the green industrial strategy, with the hope of leveraging, even 3 times as much from the private sector. We're looking at the city and region growth deals, which will be vital as well as part of that in terms of investment. And a lot of that will be around the research and innovation side as well. And of course, committed to Horizon Europe. We do face challenge, and the sector faces challenges from Brexit. But as I say, staying involved with Horizon Europe, the successor to Horizon, is absolutely vital, and the UK government is committed to that. But remember that money coming from the EU is dwarfed in many cases by the money that the UK government and the UK are spending as a whole, which benefits Scotland massively. In terms of the other part of the question, which was around about trust and science, we've seen that with vaccines in the last few weeks. Not so much in this country, although it's had a knock-on effect. But when leaders, people with influence, people who in many cases should know better, question without really any reason to, and perhaps in some cases for political reasons, the success of things like the vaccine, and particularly Oxford AstraZeneca, that puts us in a very difficult situation. So we have to respect the science. We have to make sure that anything like that, decisions like that, are made based on the evidence in front. But what we can't allow is the politics to come into it, because that's what's been happening recently. I think UK science has played a sterling job over the last 2 years and will continue to forward, and we must get behind it.
And Paul O'Kane, can I come to you next?
Thank you very much. In my kind of opening comments, I spoke about, I think the important role that science will play in our recovery, and looking forward to how can we increase the profile, I think, of science. It shouldn't have taken, perhaps in some ways, a pandemic for the issue to come to the fore, and we do need to do more, I think, to say that this sector needs to be better supported and more high profile, perhaps, in our politics sometimes, because I think very often it can be seen and viewed by some as a side issue or a kind of fringe issue, which absolutely isn't. So for Scottish Labour, it's about putting it front and centre across all of our recovery plans. And I'd spoken about, for example, in education. So we want to see a marked increase in investment in STEM throughout, particularly young people's lives. But I think also in terms of the research within the university sector. And I think it's interesting, that Jamie talks about the kind of Horizon issue. Certainly from a UK level, the Labour Party have been pushing really clearly on it is not good enough simply to have an 11th hour deal on that funding, where there was a great deal of uncertainty. We need to have clarity on what the stability of that funding will be going forward. And we really need to push the UK government on those issues. So it's about efficiency of funding, I think. Then obviously looking forward in terms of both the health recovery and ensuring that we can continue to research and innovate in terms of not only the pandemic but other areas of health research that perhaps have been put to one side as we begin the recovery process from the pandemic. I think also the green recovery, hugely important. And, for us, that's about taking action and working with scientists and basing our policy decision making on the science. We can't wait. I think we all know that. But I think the reality is we hear a lot of warm words, but perhaps not enough action. So Scottish Labour has outlined its green plans, and that involves very practical measures, for example, more sustainable public transport, looking at how do we develop electric vehicle technology here in Scotland, and how do we invest in the science and technology that goes along with that. But to answer the second part of the question on trust in science, it really disheartens me, and I'm sure it disheartens everyone here, when you hear COVID skepticism or denial. Even last night, I was out campaigning. Someone stopped our car to tell me why the COVID pandemic was a hoax. It is unbelievable how much of that kind of prevails within society. So we have a responsibility as politicians. We're absolutely clear that we will follow the science, we'll be led by the science, that we support our scientists when they come under that kind of level of attack. And it's tempting, of course, to try and sometimes politicise these issues, but it is important that we protect the integrity, I think, of scientists and the scientific community as we come through the pandemic and as we now begin to move into the stages of recovery.
Thank you. And Julia Brown, can I come to you next?
Thank you. Yes. So on the question of following the science, absolutely need to build that discipline into the heart of what we do. However, we do also have to remember that not all scientists agree with each other at all times, and that makes it difficult for us to plot a path through their advice. So I think it's much more helpful if scientists, when they are presenting information and communicating, that we can work more collaboratively, and groups can combine their resources and combine their expertise to communicate with politicians and other stakeholders, so that we can have more confidence and trust. And I think there's great strides in terms of sharing data and these open source information, etc. But we do also have to be mindful that the data and the information should really go through peer review and critique before it is necessarily disseminated widely, because some of the challenges that creates around communication and understanding. So I would say that the use of advisory groups has been good to see across the COVID pandemic. It's sourcing the right people and listening to their advice, I think is sometimes the challenge, and acting upon their advice as quickly as possible, but recognising that put 10 scientists in the room and you're not going to come up with one answer. I think the second thing is about language. Science can come across as a foreign language to many people, and they just don't necessarily have the knowledge and expertise to understand what we're saying. So that's why I think it's really important, the STEM strategy that we have, building in from schools much more familiarity and understanding of science. Programs such as the primary engineer, I think, are absolutely fantastic as well. So we want to see more investment in STEM teachers to build trust, but also general language understanding and skills around understanding risk and benefit, and understanding statistics, because we see all this information about X number of people, but we don't know to necessarily look at, well, what's the sample size? And that affects all of your activity, whether that's about taking part in certain sports versus taking your medicine. So I think more of a general training and understanding of simple statistics and risk-benefit analysis would be really helpful moving forward.
And finally, Richard Lockhead.
Hi. So I think the question was, would a future administration in our party follow the science? The second part was about the disinformation issue. Firstly, I think, as people have seen in Scotland, hopefully, that the SNP government did take on the scientific advice, and we've taken a more cautious approach to deal with the pandemic in Scotland than many other countries. And of course, in a democracy, it's the politicians that take the decisions, because they're held to account by Parliament, taking on board scientific advice. And what I found over the last year, because when I came into this job as Minister for Further Education, Higher Education Science, I didn't expect to be dealing with a pandemic for over a year, and therefore I've dealt a lot with the scientific community with my own responsibilities. And of course, the science has never said, don't do this or don't do that. the science has said, here is the advice of the measures you should take in any particular set of circumstances, mitigating factors and the impact of your decisions and so on and so forth. And that's what the politicians have had to take on board, balancing all the harms. So we take on board the scientific advice and we balance all the other issues we have to deal with. And all the scientists I've spoken to over the last year have generally said to me, if you want the scientific answer, it would be that no one leaves their house ever. But clearly, we can't have that situation. Therefore, if people are to leave their homes, this is the following mitigation factors we should put in place. So that scientific advice has been crucially important getting us through the past year. And in terms of the future and following the scientific advice, I think the status of science has been elevated by the pandemic. And I think that looking into the climate emergency, which Lorna and others were mentioning, we have to learn the lessons from the pandemic and make sure the scientific advice is very much at the heart of decisions we take over tackling the climate emergency. And finally, in terms of disinformation, I think we've all experienced as politicians, some phenomenal comments and views out there amongst the population with a very small minority. And that disinformation spreads very quickly due to social media. And I think the answer to that is partially scientists. I think the public trusts scientists more than ever before, perhaps a lot more than politicians, and therefore scientists should be at the forefront of our efforts to tackle disinformation and to use their authority and their status to get the message across.
Thank you. Just a reminder to keep our answers as succinct as possible to get through as many questions as possible tonight. Without a surprise, in the questions that we have received before the panel today and live through the Q&A function, the majority of them focused on funding. So can I please ask the panel, what is your funding model for scientific research in Scotland? And the pandemic has shown the value of a strong scientific base built on long-term stable funding. How will your party enable scientists in Scotland to have that long-term vision and stop them having to chase short-term smaller grants? So what is your overall funding model for science in Scotland, and how will you create long-term funding solutions to prevent the chasing of short-term smaller grants? Can I start with Jamie Halcrow Johnson, please?
Thanks very much indeed. It's a really good question, a very important one. And in fact, it goes across a number of different areas because one of the concerns that many different kind of groups and not just within science, but out with as well, business and certainly kind of social enterprises, some of which do fall in within the science sector, have come up with is the need for longer term funding, a more clear path, as it were, through to allow kind of planning ahead, and there's been an over-reliance perhaps on very short-term project funding or essentially 1 year rolling funding for some areas, which has caused a great deal of problems. Obviously a lot of this comes through the UK government, and it will continue to. And I think, as I mentioned in my previous answer, the commitment to that has been only increased since the pandemic, and the recognition that, as I say, that science and innovation will be part of addressing a whole host of different issues that we face within this country. And we talked about health, but we remember there's a variety of different issues within health itself. It's not just physical health, mental health, and others. So, as I say, the UK government is very much committed to that. Within the Scottish government and our responsibilities, it is about looking through the universities, making sure that they are adequately supported, which they haven't been over the last few years in terms of that research and development side. It is about making sure that from those organisations that support businesses as well, that they're able to do that, and they have that responsibility, but they also have the funding to make sure that they can make decisions. We've seen far too many really successful Scottish ideas rolled out, but then essentially bought out and taken abroad because that funding hasn't been available here. Just looking kind of throughout the second side, as I say, we are very, very positive about the opportunities for UK and Scottish science. We want to make sure that it is the heart of what we do, and that needs that pipeline all the way through. So it's not just about the finished product, it's also right through to early investment in our education sector and our STEM sector, making sure that there are links through organizations, such as, the other organizations like Innovate and etc. that will be part of that too. So it's a very long kind of a process needed of support across various different sectors, but that commitment is absolutely there from the Scottish Conservatives and from the UK government.
Thank you.
It's going to be vital.
We're going to move on to Paul O'Kane now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think this is a key question and critical. I think one of the things that we're perhaps guilty of doing as well is looking at this in political cycles sometimes and thinking about a 5-year term of office, a 5-year parliament, when actually we know that scientific research can be decades long in some ways, and we need to really, I think more broadly about how we invest and support the long periods of research, particularly in terms of discovery. And I think Scotland is a real leader in terms of discovery science, and I think that's so important. Obviously, it being the backbone of essentially then research and development. So, for me, I think there's the critical question about how do we ensure that there is sufficiency of funding around that Horizon 2020 issue, which I mentioned in a previous answer. It's not been good enough to have that kind of late in the day agreement. I think Labour at a UK level have been pushing for clarity around how that funding will continue, but also I think how will we ensure that there's no detriment essentially to the current and existing funding streams that are there to then pay for wider European engagement. I think also there is this key issue around how much do we spend, as in terms of GDP on research, and that whole issue. I don't think has been sufficiently addressed in terms of where we are. We could be doing a lot more. Labour have called for 3% of GDP to be spent on science research. So I think those are two really important points that have been advocated certainly at the UK level by Ed Miliband and Keane, who are spokespeople. I think in terms of Scotland, we need to very keen, Scottish Labour are very keen in the recovery to look at our university sector and how do we really, I think, engage in looking at what funding can be, I think, shared in terms of a wider community model. So looking at universities and institutions as anchor institutions and communities and funding research that will benefit not only, of course, the institution, but the communities around it whom it serves. So that's about jobs, it's about supply chain, it's about pipeline, and it's about having a really sustainable programme of investment that benefits that wider community.
Thank you. And can I go to Julia Brown, please? And a reminder, the question is, what will be your funding model for research and science? And how will you prevent the chasing of short-term contracts and funding?
Okay, thank you. So massive issue, this one. Every scientist that I speak to, it's a kind of number one concern about where their funding is going to come from. And funding cycles drive behaviours and affect the types of projects that you can and can't do. So funding comes from several sources, and I do think a blended model is appropriate. So we've got funding from industrial sources, funding from charities, and funding from the public. And each project will have a different, or institute or organisation will have a different blend. And we've seen a lot of feedback from charities over the COVID-19 situation that their ability to fund research in the future is going to be restricted because they don't have the same level of funds that they had pre-COVID. And so that's one area that we're looking at within the Lib Dems, is thinking about how do we support scientific research continue when some of that third sector funding is less available. We need to see an increase in business expenditure and R&D. We really need to see that increase right across the UK and particularly in Scotland. So we need to see that level go up. And we need to keep our public sector funding to ensure that we have that basic research in place. I mean, when we see how the COVID vaccine came about, that came on the back of some long-term research that had been supported over many years, and we're very grateful for that now. So I know you're looking for a number. I don't have a number for you ahead of our manifesto, and I don't think there can be one number because it's a mixture of funding from different sources. But I do think that the exit from Europe gives us a big challenge around future funding on projects that were funded by Horizon, and also the international development projects that are now being affected by changing in funding priorities. So I'd like to be able to give you a number, and hopefully we can come back to that in future, but it needs to go up. The number doesn't go down, it needs to go up.
Thank you. And Richard Lockhead.
It's a good question, and I think the impact of COVID, of course, really put a focus on the need for stability for research contracts in Scotland. As a government in Scotland, the SNP brought forward, £75 million near the beginning of the crisis, and then a further £20 million just a few weeks ago, because we recognise the importance of supporting our research contracts so that people could stay in post. And even though they may be suspended doing their work because of the restrictions, that the work was there to continue with once they were able to go back into laboratories and continue their research. So that is a really important issue, and that's why we did recognise that. I have commissioned the Scottish Funding Council to look at the sustainability and coherence of further higher education going forward because of some of these really big challenges we've been discussing in this forum. And of course, there's a big section in their report on research. So that has been looked at, and we'll take on board their recommendations. What I would say is not helpful, of course, is the UKRI, which supplies a lot of research funds for Scotland. So much of this is reserved as long as we're part of the UK. They've just had to cope, of course, at the moment with a sudden cut in their global challenge research funds. They've had to find £125 million out of a £245 million pre-committed budget for these research contracts. And I'm told this is the first time this has ever happened where any government has cut contracts mid-contract. And it's causing a lot of pandemonium and concern at UK level, and £13 million, give or take, of those contracts in Scottish universities. So I think all governments should recognise that stability for research is really important, and you can't just turn up one day and slash mid-contract the budgets for those particular research projects.
And finally, Lorna Slater, thank you.
So I've got quite a lot to say on this, so I'll try and keep it succinct for Talat. So the project that I'm working on, the Tidal Turbine with Orbital Marine Power, was a Horizon 2020 funded project. So that's a mix of industry and research together. So we're working with academic institutions and businesses. And of course, we're now losing that kind of funding through Brexit. So that is a massive challenge for us going forward. The UK has not shown the same kind of commitment to that level of integrated scientific and industry research. The project I was working on had 11 different companies in 6 different European countries working together, that kind of massive collaboration to really drive an industry forward and to really change our understanding of how marine energy works. We don't have that anymore. We're even struggling to function within the constraints of Brexit. Simple things like not being able to exchange tools, not being able to send equipment back and forth easily. We can't even get the paint for the turbine into the UK anymore. I think we're only just at the start of seeing the kind of disaster around Brexit. So in terms of the funding model, the Scottish Greens are very uncomfortable with the marketisation of academic funding. We would like to resist this marketisation. We support measures that will allow Scotland's universities to oppose the marketisation of higher education and to distance themselves from mechanisms such as the Research for Excellence Framework, Teaching Excellence Frameworks, and other artificially competitive funding mechanisms. We commit to making additional university funding through the Scottish Funding Council contingent on commitments to eliminate casual and insecure contracts and to raise the wages of the lowest paid staff. So I notice in the Q&A, quite a lot of the questions are about mental health, how we support people working in academia, and that's a big part of it, is that, cuts, making it competitive artificially have meant that academia has had to follow the worst practices of industries with insecure contracts, low pay, and not treating its staff right. In terms of the things we would like to focus research funding on specifically, we want to develop an international research hub for zero carbon biochemicals to help transition Grangemouth to zero carbon. We want to restore funding to support Scotland's agricultural research institutions. We feel that sustainable agriculture is part of the solution to the climate crisis and is a big part of making sure Scotland has food security going forward and reforming how our land is managed as well.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you. Thank you for your answers there. I'm moving on to the economy and manufacturing. And for those who, we've had lots of questions come in, and just to reassure those who have been asking questions, I'm taking one question from that was submitted beforehand, and I'm taking one question from the live board at the moment. So please rest assured that I am reading this and responding and asking questions where I can. So on to the next question. What is your strategy for ensuring that where world-leading research is taking place, for example, in green technologies, that Scotland reaps the economic benefits in areas such as manufacturing? And to supplement that from the live panel, Scotland is great at science, research and innovation, but the big challenge is scaling up to the manufacturing level. What does the panel suggest is the best approach to scaling up manufacturing in a sustainable way? And I'll be starting with Paul O'Kane on that one.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think it is key, and there is a point here, I think, about how do we ensure that, where we essentially have strong kind of, discovery research and strong research, how do we then move that forward to the practical application in terms of manufacturing? And I think there's something in here about ensuring strong partnerships with private investment as well, because I think that's going to be key. So we need to ensure that those partnerships are there, and that government is supporting that dialogue and that conversation to ensure that private investment can be here in Scotland and flourish here in Scotland and continue in Scotland as a key part of the pipeline. And I think it's also about thinking how does the policy agenda around, for example, that important green recovery that I talked about, how does that fit in terms of manufacturing? And I spoke about how Scottish Labour intends to try and take a lot of those issues and essentially improve the technology development and also then the manufacturing development here in Scotland. So if you look at something like, for example, our public transport that I spoke about earlier, it's about how do we ensure that the policy initiative around greening our public transport has to be made and built in Scotland. So it's about investing in those sorts of industries to ensure that local authorities can then access that upskilled manufacturing. So for me, there are a number of practical ways we can do that in terms of obviously government investment. But for me, it also has to be backed by that element of private investment as well. And I do think we need to do more in Scotland around looking at how we lever that in, how we give it a surety and a certainty. And I have to say that ongoing continual debates about constitution don't help with a lot of that. So I think for me it is about certainty and surety.
Thank you. And can I go to Julia Brown, please?
Okay, so scale up of businesses is a classic Scottish problem, irrespective of the sector, and we've been trying to address this for some time now. So when I've talked to businesses and people who are investing in businesses, the types of things that they really focus on, and particularly from a manufacturing side, is first and foremost is your route to market. Do you have an accessible route to market from wherever you're manufacturing from? So that brings us questions around logistics of getting your product when it's made in Scotland to the marketplace, wherever that is, and whether that's a domestic market or an international market. So there are things that we can do to make that easier, but obviously with Brexit as it has occurred is not going to help the situation. And also as a domestic market, we can be quite small in some sectors, and so we have to understand that businesses are looking to supply products outside Scotland unless we can really drive up a substantial market for them here. The second thing is around access to talent and making sure that we have the right skills and expertise and people to work in the facilities. And so we've had an underinvestment in some of the skills and expertise over years. And so we need to accelerate some of the apprenticeship and training programs, particularly in new technologies, to ensure that we have the best workforce we possibly can have for the future. We've talked briefly about business confidence because that is key. And so the question around whether we were part of Europe, part of the UK, those things have not helped business decisions that are looking at funding cycles, which are 10 years before they get a return on their investment or longer. And then finally, when you're coming to funding, it's looking like, well, not everything can be funded by the public sector. So it's about where you're bringing in private funding from and therefore what is expected by that private funder in response to the project. So those are the things that we need to look at. But absolutely, it is possible to do, but we just need to be quite rigorous in going through those rate limiting factors and trying to come up with some solutions to that. And I think particularly the public sector around procurement of products could do a lot better in terms of opening up to domestic businesses and procuring more swiftly and efficiently from domestic producers. So I'll stop there, Talat.
Thank you, Julia. And just a reminder of the question to the panel: how do we sustainably scale up our manufacturing to reap the economic benefits of scientific discovery in Scotland? Richard Lockhead.
Hi. Well, I think this is a question we have to get right if we're going to ensure that science plays a role in the post-COVID recovery. And it is a big challenge. And that's one reason why the SNP government commissioned Anton Muscatelli, the principal of Glasgow University, for his recent report to look at how we can have a greater contribution from our universities to the economy, because it is a strange situation where we're leading the world in research and innovation, but we don't when it comes to productivity, and we have to bridge that gap somehow. In his report, he's spoken about giving a kind of mission to Scottish Enterprise and Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Funding Council to work much closer together to achieve this. I think that partnership approach that Paul and others have mentioned is really, really important. And I think we have to ensure the interface, which is working really well, bringing academia and business together. And I think in the last year, the figures are available for, added £62 million to GDA from its own projects. I think we have to scale that up and find ways of scaling that up into manufacturing and upstream and downstream, and grow that interface. I think that's a really important way forward as well. Also, can I just say that inward investment actually has performed really well in Scotland, despite this constitutional debate. I think we're second behind London. So there's no evidence whatsoever that the constitutional debate in Scotland's putting off business decisions and inward investment.
Lorna Slater, can I come to you next? Thank you.
Absolutely. So I work in Scottish manufacturing. It's something that's my bailiwick, if you like. So the Tidal Turbine that we're building currently in the Port of Dundee is 73 metres long. It was built with steel bought from Liberty Steel in Motherwell. We've kept the Texo in Dundee busy for coming up to about 18 months there, and that's hundreds of workers, fabricators, painters, welders, managers, the whole like crane operators and so on. That's one tidal turbine. Imagine if we were building 10 or 50. We could keep BIFAB busy. We can keep Ferguson Marine busy. We have the scope here in Scotland for a green industrial revolution. And there's a big part of that will be in our manifesto, which we'll see. But I think what we mustn't do is repeat the mistakes of the past. So in the past, when wind farm contracts were being handed out and so on, not enough conditions were placed on those contracts. So we handed Scotland's valuable resources away to multinational companies who went off to make the most profit they could. The jobs went overseas, the work went overseas. The community benefit was never realized. Let's not make that mistake again. So this time around, let's make sure when we invest in our next generation of renewable energy that we make public support conditional on supporting Scottish supply chains and meeting fair work standards. And that's what you'll see in our manifesto. We can't just be handing this away. And we would do this through a renewables leasing process. I'd also like to clear up a point which I feel very strongly about and is something within my own experience, is that public sector investment does not drive out private sector investment. It's the exact opposite of that. If, for example, imagine you've got a project that's going to cost £10 million to build whatever it is, a tidal turbine, a hydrogen plant, whatever it is. If the public sector invests £2 million in that, By investing in that, the government signals that it's done its due diligence, that it has confidence in the project, that it's got a direction of travel that it is willing to commit to long term. That brings confidence in the private sector, and the private sector will then be much more encouraged to contribute the other £8 million. So for an investment of £2 million, the government now has, and the Scottish people now have, a £10 million project on the table. So I want to be really clear that we expect public investment to bring private investment. That's how that's how it works. Absolutely, we think that every bit of public investment in our green industrial revolution will pay off dividends and will absolutely help us grow our economy and recover from COVID.
Thank you. And finally, on this question, Jimmy Halcrow Johnson, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, a lot of the areas that I was going to cover have already been covered, but I mean, it is a vital question that was something that we covered on the Scottish Parliament's Economy Committee, and we looked into some of the areas around business support and how you look particularly within the energy sector. And we also did an inquiry, as has been mentioned, into the BIFAB situation, which, you know, in itself, there is an opportunity for a Scottish company with heavy public sector investment to play a role in something, you know, in a sector that is only growing around our shores, and yet obviously it's been a bad investment, and there have been a number of areas in the past where this has come up. And if you look at how you know, from my Highlands and Islands region, there are a number of places where we could be doing manufacturing around Nigg, Ardassia and others, and you know, these are perfect sites to be producing the turbines that are going to be going around our shores, driving our electricity, and in many cases being supported through funding. Just looking a little bit as a longer term, I think there are roles for both the Scottish and the UK governments within this. As we've talked about, there's partly through the just general funding, but also providing that supply chain, providing the skills that are needed going forward, and making sure that those are in place so that any business coming and looking at Scotland as a place to develop and to grow, and perhaps with some sort of, as Lorna mentioned, support, can do so with confidence that those key parts of what they need to do as businesses are going to be there, and are going to be there sustainably.
Thank you. We'll now move on to education. And I think it's important that I state that actually a question's come in that is on the live Q&A, and it's the one that has been pushed to the top the most. So it's of most interest and of most importance to people who are on the call at the moment from those who have responded. And there's two parts to this question. If I can find it from scrolling down. Practical skills are a vital element of science education, yet many young people have missed out on the opportunity to learn and apply these skills throughout the pandemic. This includes undergraduates and young people at school. What steps will your party take to support practical work in the sciences and ensure that those who have missed out over the pandemic are not disadvantaged long term? And the second question, which got the highest response on the live Q&A, SQA curriculum is stuck in disciplinary silos. How will your party ensure that our school curriculum is fit for the trajectories of young Scots entering an interdisciplinary world? So moving away from the silos of education and the reality of interdisciplinary work, science and research. And if we can start off with Julia Brown, please.
Cracking questions. So thank you for that. So practical skills, first of all, totally understand that. I've got 3 students at university, and only one of them has managed to get some practical time and in labs. And yeah, it's absolutely vital as part of your courses, both as undergraduate and also in schools. I think it's been great to see how labs have evolved in schools, first of all, to sort of see that the physical facilities there, but we're still struggling around getting enough STEM teachers that can help students through the practical aspects. I also know that in terms of working with Skills Development Scotland and their conversations with employers, that many of potential employers have talked about the lack of practical skills in graduates. And so the apprenticeship programme is very much tailored around giving more practical skills to people. So unfortunately, again, the apprenticeship programme is too small in my view. It needs to be much larger and engage with many more companies and also have access to more facilities for practical elements, particularly for these new technologies which are coming through and thinking about the climate change and aspects associated with the research involved with that. So practical skills, a big problem. I would like to work with businesses to see whether or not they can take more interns. We have some work ongoing with the Lib Dems in terms of supporting undergraduates and graduates get more internships with businesses, and particularly on the practical front. And again, looking at investing in colleges so that we can do more practical skills to catch up. So I think there's going to be a period of time where perhaps we can look at holiday period and collaboration with others to upskill in the practical side. SQA stuck in silos, yes. The school curriculum is difficult to change in a short space of time, and I would love to make many more changes, listening to teachers and students around how do we get this interdisciplinary approach, because I think breaking down silos is absolutely the way to go. But we do need some core skills in maths and in general science in particular to understand the interdisciplinary opportunities. So yeah, put more teachers into SQA and listen more to students and listen more to potential employers as to actually what we want to teach, and move away from historical subjects that we've been focused on for many years and think about some new ones.
Thank you. Just a reminder of the question we're asking: how do we support those, whether they're at school, undergraduate and postgraduate students who have not had a chance to develop their skill set, practical skill set as a consequence of the pandemic? How do we support them and help them recover in that skills gap? And the second question is about silos and in getting young people ready to understand learning about interdisciplinary education rather than having the SQA in silos currently. Richard Lockhead, can I come to you next?
Thanks. And firstly, just to reassure everyone that our colleges and universities are doing an enormous amount of work just now to make sure that anyone who has lost out on teaching time is able to catch up with that. And just before the Parliament went into dissolution for the elections, we announced that we will cover the costs, the government's going to cover the costs of extra time required for students if they've not completed their courses. Because quite clearly, particularly apprentices and others, they've not been able to have that face-to-face time that's really important for many particular courses. So in terms of student support and other means of support, the Scottish Funding Council has agreed with the colleges in particular that those who have lost out for practical time will be able to stay on longer or whatever is required to get that. And in terms of the SQA, practical issues in courses and schools are really important, and the SQA are doing a lot of work, and Education Scotland doing a lot of work on STEM subjects. We're seeing an increase in foundation apprenticeships for STEM subjects, more teachers in STEM subjects as well. The career-changing bursary that's available that gives, I think it's £20,000 to anyone who wishes to change career to go in to teach a STEM subject in schools. That's been a big success. So we are moving forward in terms of these issues. In terms of the SQA being stuck in silos, the Curriculum for Excellence, of course, is all about giving our young people the skills of the 21st century. So the Curriculum for Excellence is doing well, it's working well. In terms of SQA's future and getting out of silos, we publish our manifesto, I think, on Thursday it is, so I can't really say what will be in the manifesto, but no doubt these issues will all be covered in terms of education.
And Lorna Slater, can I come to you, please?
Thank you very much. I think it's fitting that these two questions are asked together. So I'll start at the beginning with small children and the primary school skills. In terms of practical skills, I think that means practical skills for children as well. That means physical skills. That means creativity. That means resilience. That means social skills. And to that end, you'll see in our manifesto, we have a strong commitment to outdoor education. We want to end homework for primary school children. We think that after hours children should be out learning those practical skills, those social skills, playing sport, reading books, interacting with people, learning about their world, not just sitting staring at screens. And another big part, our sort of headline for the manifesto is that we would like to raise the school starting age to 7 and introduce a kindergarten stage from 3 to 6 year olds. This has been shown to increase, again, that breadth of skills for children and help with educational inequalities as well. So those are 3 really practical things that we think can tackle educational inequalities, both that exist before COVID and that were aggravated by COVID. But I think they also bring in those kind of practical skills. At the other end, at sort of university level and secondary education level, this is something where other countries actually do better than the UK. So I went to university in Canada. My degree was in electromechanical engineering design. So that was a dual degree. So there was an interdisciplinary element there. It's common in North American universities to do something called co-oping. That's what I did. So that although my degree was 5 years, I spread it over the course of 7 years. And in that, I worked as an engineer for 2 of those years. So the university helps you find a real job with real pay. It's not an internship that uses your engineering skills so that when you graduate, on the day you graduate, I actually had 2 years of work on my resume, on my CV. So that's the kind of things that are happening in other countries. We can do that here in the UK. And a big part of that is, as my colleague, I think it was Liberal Democrat, said, that the problem is it's difficult to change the curriculum. So something that we've committed to in our manifesto is to establish a process for curriculum review, because I think everyone's right. The interdisciplinary learning, less assessment, less formal measures, more practical learning is the way forward. But we need a process by which we can look at that curriculum and upgrade it as we go. So that's what we're committing to.
Thank you. And can I go to Jamie Halcrow Johnston, please?
Thanks very much. Again, as other panelists have said, it's such an important area. I mean, the first thing I would say is there's actually been a big issue with the STEM side even before the pandemic, and it's obviously been an issue that's been going on for some time within our school. But I'll kind of come back to that if I can. When I was covering the kind of colleges and universities brief, one of the real concerns at all the institutions I spoke to, many of the students that I spoke to, was that how do we deal with practical courses, particularly those within science and innovation, where you've got to be in either a lab or you've got to be in a place where you've got your kind of colleagues around you, or you're doing work like that, and obviously that can't be done from home. So it caused real concern, and the knock-on concern was, look, if we're trying to finish our courses and they've been delayed, and then there's another generation or another year group coming in wanting to start theirs, how does that impact? And I think the only way that, and I think Richard Locker probably mentioned it, is that the financial support. There needs to be the increased financial support to universities and colleges to help them get through that. But that also requires, it's not quite as simple as that, because it obviously requires the facilities to do it. So it's putting extra pressure on limited resources when we're still social distancing and the like. So it's an extremely difficult situation to resolve, and hopefully as soon as we can get back to it. On the other kind of question that came up that was asked, I mean, there is no doubt that there's been an issue around how we've created those kind of relationships within this sector, within our schools, and its relationship with the curriculum. There's been a problem that for some time, as I mentioned, before the pandemic, but going further back, that we've needed a more, we've needed to provide those more practical opportunities, because actually in many cases those are the ones that provide the opportunities and the kind of interest within some of the subjects. What we want to see in our recovering in our schools is more teachers, and obviously that will include more STEM teachers. And we also want to make sure that allows kind of increases in subject choice. But another area that's come up again and again has been that relationship between schools and local businesses, providing those opportunities for young people to go out and learn and to gain experience within local companies and the like. And that hasn't been good enough over the years. There are some very good examples, but too often that's not happening. We need to make sure that those opportunities are available and that young people can get that practical experience, which may not be part or may not be part of the curriculum, but it has to be kind of going forward.
Thank you. And Paul O'Kane.
Thank you. I think a really important question, and in a number of parts, I suppose. So I think the COVID context and that learning loss, if you like, that we hear about, and that requirement for recovery from school point of view, but also from college and university. And particularly, I think the question really focusing on those practical skills and experiences. The Scottish Labour have laid out our kind of recovery plans in terms of education. And certainly focusing really clearly on that kind of personalised and individualised plan for young people around their comeback, if you like, to school. And for us, that should absolutely focus on the subject mix that those young people have chosen to explore, particularly in secondary, and really building up those practical skills as required through perhaps kind of more personalised tutoring opportunities and more personalised input from teachers. And the backdrop to that, of course, across the piece will be more teachers in classrooms, and particularly in the practical subjects, certainly more STEM specialists. I'm just making sure I get all this right, because my election agent is actually a physics teacher, so just make sure I say the right things or else he'll get into trouble. But essentially, I think when we look at colleges and unis as well, what does their recovery plan look like in terms of comeback? How do we ensure that we're maximising funding for things like summer schools, opportunities for young people who are making the transition from school to university, to gain some of the practical skills that they have maybe missed out on? Working with the college sector as well to ensure that that's an option and a pathway if required, around particularly if someone needs to resit subjects, but also I think using the skills there to have those practical experiences. I think there's also a broader point here about how do we value practical kind of learning and training throughout school. I think certainly from early years through to primary and secondary, we need to invest more in the capital so that the spaces and the facilities are available in schools where young people can learn practical skills. There's been some great innovations, I think, in primary schools to kind of look at what's available, but there's a bit of a postcode lottery sometimes. There's not a consistency across the board. So we do want to see more of that and better capital investment, particularly on STEM areas, STEM opportunities, outdoor learning spaces, all of those things. And then I think to go into the broader point on the SQA, I think, again, there's been a huge amount of discussion, I think, around the role of formal exams, the role of practical assessment, the kind of how do subjects interact with one another across the curriculum. I think there is going to be detail on that in our manifesto as well. But there certainly is a national debate, and we certainly need to, I think, in the next Parliament, have a serious conversation about curriculum and about exams. And for Scottish Labour, it's about trying to ensure that we get the best outcomes for young people.
Thank you very much. I'm very aware of time, and there are two questions that I think are critical, and I'm going to use my privilege as chair because I've decided that these are critical questions, and I'm going to ask them as two, even though they are separately themed. The first is about equality and inclusion within science. The question is, what aspects, equality and inclusion has always been an issue when considering STEM participation. What aspects do you consider most in need of action in the next Scottish Parliament? And what steps will your party take to ensure that science at every level is diverse and inclusive, and that there is equal access to participation? And the second question, and I think perhaps I should have asked this right at the top, when putting science at the forefront of your work over the next term, politicians clearly need to effectively use research and evidence in decision making. What skills do you think MSPs should have around understanding research and evidence so they can make the most informed policy decisions? So what can we do to create more inclusive and accessible pathways into STEM so that those from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, disabled people, women considering the leaky pipeline, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds that are living in poverty have equal access to science and technology, engineering, mathematics? And what skills do you think you need to really be able to understand and make the most of research and science to be able to make informed decisions? I will first come to, let me get this right, Richard Lockhead.
Thanks. Yes, the issue of diversity and inclusiveness in universities and science is, of course, a very topical and crucial one. And there's a lot of work taking place just now within the university sector, working with Advanced Higher Education, the body, who I just spoke at an event they had just a couple of weeks ago on this. And it's clear that some of the picture is improving for diversity, but we've got a long way to go in many of our universities. And it's really important that the Scottish Funding Council, who are holding our universities to account on these issues, continue to do so. But I do think that the next government should certainly make it an absolute priority that over the course of the next 5-year Parliament, this is something we do get absolutely on top of. There's a range of issues that have been introduced over the last few years, from gender action plans to gender-based violence initiatives and so on. And I think we have to just accelerate them over the next 5 years, and if we all sign up to that, I'm sure we'll make progress. But it's good to see some of the work that our universities are now undertaking at the behest of the Scottish Funding Council and some of the other organisations that they're working closely with. So it's very much a partnership approach. In terms of what skills MSPs require, clearly it's very important that MSPs are able to listen, and we sometimes get into dogmatic troughs, which we don't get out of, and we shouldn't be like that. We should always listen and listen to the science, and also get out and about and meet our scientists and visit institutions in Scotland. I think is really important for all MSPs, especially the newly elected ones, to do to understand the wealth we have out there.
Thank you. Just looking at the time, I'm looking for 1 minute answers. So can I go to Lorna Slater next, please? Great.
My answers are almost the same. So in terms of academic inclusion, academia is dominated by cis, white, able-bodied, middle-aged men. A particular concern to me is sexism in academia. I recently traveled to Antarctica with women scientists from all over the world, and this was the standard complaint was how women are treated in academia, and what a huge barrier that is. That stops them from moving forward, particularly women of color. So that's something that I would like to get more involved in, because along with the lack of job, lack of low pay and lack of job security and stuff, working in academia is actually brutal, and it shouldn't be brutal. The harder we make it for anyone from a disadvantaged background to get into it. And related to that, what skills should MSP has? Well, MSPs are largely cis, white, able-bodied, middle-aged white men. And so I think that the most effective MSPs is actually come as a team. So it is important that some MSPs have STEM skills, but it's also important that some MSPs have a variety of lived experiences. Some are good communicators, some are good negotiators. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. Can I go to Jimmy Halcrow Johnson, please?
Yeah, I'm now very, very conscious of making a short answer now. But my grandmother was a scientist when there were very, very few, and I've been involved in women in science events in Parliament. I think it's absolutely vital that we continue to promote role models like Anne Glover and others, and that also that we make sure that Scottish Government agencies support people from a variety of different backgrounds getting into science where they can, but also making sure that as we mentioned, that academic pathway is there and that we're not excluding any backgrounds. In terms of MSPs, what we need to see is the continued engagement by organisations like the Royal Society of Chemistry, Royal Society of Edinburgh, in events like Science and Parliament, and also that we're using that for our advice when we're in committees and those sorts of things. So, and that engagement's key.
Thank you. And Paul Kane, I'm very, very aware we might get chucked out at 18:15. So.
Thank you. I think I would agree with a lot of what's been said already in terms of this huge issue. We need to, role models for me is really key. And I think not just the kind of national or historic level role models, but actually at a local level. How do we better connect community role models into schools? As a gay man myself growing up, I never saw an LGBT role model in science at school. So I think something that's really key is working on this front. Some of those exist already, and that's great, but we need to do more. We need to invest in that so that we can support our schools, certainly, to build that up. And then briefly, I think on engagement with the science, as an MSP, certainly would want to have those sort of relationships. I think we have to sometimes get beyond the small minutiae of politics and the fighting that goes on, and actually say, when it comes to science, we all need to get around the table, listen to the experts, listen to what they're telling us, and try and find a consensus to move forward.
Thank you. I've been told that we won't get chucked out at 18:15, so that's actually quite helpful. But I happen to think a 1 minute answer for a politician is a good skill to have, regardless. So Julia Brown next. Thank you.
Okay, scientists, I think, can be seen as a bit of an intimidating club that people find difficult to join, partly because of the jargon and also because they're just generally understanding what they do. So I think we need to do more about opening up what science is all about. It can be fun and interesting, and have a lot of admiration for what the Big Bang Theory did for physicists, and encouraging people to look at that as another way of getting involved in science. So I think in terms of the leaky pipeline, that is a massive issue. And I think organisations need to look at their unconscious bias and in terms of how they set up and manage their institutions and the research programmes, so that they're not creating too many barriers for people of different backgrounds to get involved in science and research moving forward. In terms of courses, I think we need to set institutions targets, because money and targets drives behaviour. And so I think we need to be tougher on this to encourage much more thinking around addressing these issues. And then finally, in terms of MSPs and education, probability, statistics, risk benefit, and also unconscious bias.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, thank you to all the candidates here representing their parties for answering questions, and on the whole, not making me intervene too often when they talk for too long. So I appreciate that. Thank you to those who have been participating and watching today. At the top of the event, we had 150 participants, and I think that shows the value and importance placed on science currently throughout the pandemic and beyond, and pre-pandemic too. I am aware that there were many questions that came in. Some were repeated, but hopefully we've managed to answer as many as we can. And you've had a chance to be able to quiz candidates, and will continue to do so throughout the election. A huge thank you to the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the Institute of Physics for inviting me to be the chair today, and for organising, and the Royal Society of Biology, for inviting me to be the chair today, and putting a spotlight on science education and equality within science and education and research as well. Hopefully this has covered some of what you wanted to hear, but of course asking our parliamentarians questions and people who are participating in political parties questions is not something that should just happen at election time. It's something that we should be participating in and active in, and asking questions of our parliamentarians throughout their term. So please do use this opportunity to ask more questions beyond this hustings, but also participate in democracy and asking questions and scientific accountability for within politics throughout the time of the next Scottish Parliament. Thank you so much for taking part, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.